Society, Goldsmiths Student Society. We're a group that hosts conversations about what it means to be on the left today, and we run a reading group on Monday nights, we do film screenings, and we also publish the Platypus Review, which is an open submission publication, so anyone is very welcome to write for it, as long as it's about some aspect of left-wing politics. We're very open to all sorts of submissions. We also really encourage submissions that are responding to other articles that we've published or panels that we've hosted. So if you're moved to respond in writing after this panel today, you'll be very welcome. We also try and record all our panel events, and those are online on our website too, platypus1917.org. I'd like to thank our speakers very much for attending this evening. Unfortunately, one of our speakers is a little bit delayed in traffic, Jack Conrad, from the CPGB, so he will turn up when he can and respond to the conversation as it's unfolding when he gets here. So I'm sorry there's a slight sort of contingency happening there to the conversation, but it'll keep things exciting. Our other speakers, we're very happy to have our Nancy Taaffe on the very far left of the podium. Nancy Taaffe is a Socialist Party member and has been an electoral candidate for TUSC, the Trade Union Socialist Coalition, since 2011. She has been part of the project to help bring about a new mass workers' party since the Socialist Party left the militant and militant left the Labour Party in the early 1990s. She's a coordinator of the TUSC committee in Waltham Forest and works for the National Union of Teachers. Next along, we have Luke Gregory-Jones. Luke just finished his BA in politics at Goldsmiths. Second year in Goldsmiths, okay. Having left the Labour Party, the Socialist Workers' Party and the Socialist Party, Luke now operates in networks and non-party structures, and he's recently been very involved in the Goldsmiths student occupation and building the Free University of London. Next along we have Michael Theodosiadis. Michael is from Thessaloniki. He's a PhD candidate at Goldsmiths College and working on the subject of populism and democracy in Europe. He has also studied social and political theory in Birkbeck, and he's the creator of several Greek activist websites, such as egainst.com, which also has been influenced by the Square movement of 2011. A founding editor of the online political magazine respublica as well. He has been interviewed regarding the Eurozone crisis by Greek and international news networks such as the CBC and London Greek Radio. Additionally, he publishes articles in the Institute of Anarchist Studies and Constellations Journal. And then finally, we're very pleased to have Simon Griffiths, a senior lecturer from the politics department at Goldsmiths. He's been a visiting research fellow for the Centre for Political Ideologies in Oxford, worked for a variety of think tanks and public policy organisations, and was researcher to the sociologist Anthony Giddens. He's written for The Independent, The Times, The Guardian, and regularly appears on TV and radio talking about party politics. His latest book is Engaging Enemies, Hayek and the Left, published in 2014. Sounds very interesting. So I'd just like to read out the panel description again before we get started, just to get us in mind for this topic on what is a political party and what does it mean to take political action today. So, in spite of many different political currents and tendencies, perhaps the most significant question informing the left today is the issue of political party. Various left unity initiatives have taken place in the aftermath of 2008 economic crisis and subsequent downturn following Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, alongside continuing post-political tendencies inherited from the 1980s, 1990s, perspectives expressed by Hardt and Negri's Empire, Multitude and Commonwealth, John Holloway's To Change the World Without Taking Power, and the Invisible Committee's the coming insurrection, the California student protesters' Communique from an absent future, the formation of SYRIZA in Greece and the new party Podemos in Spain, who reject the organised Marxist Left, as well as the established labour unions as part of an existing political caste. In Germany, Die Linke appears poised to break into high political office, and at the same time there has been a growing crisis in the largest orthodox Marxist or Trotskyist political organisations in the Anglophone and Western European countries, which has been characterised as the crisis of actually existing Leninism. New publications have emerged, such as Jacobin magazine, N+1, Endnotes journals, as new millennial Marxism. And there has emerged a related discussion of the legacy of Marxism in principles of political organisation going back to the Second International, 1889 to 1914, or neo-Kautskyism. For instance, in Lars Lih's revisionist history of Lenin and Bolshevism and the Communist Party of Great Britain's members, Mike Macnair's book, Revolutionary Strategy, the latter occasioned by the formations of Respect Party in the UK and the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste in France. Today, perhaps the most significant question facing the left internationally goes all the way back to Marx's dispute with the anarchists in the First International. What would it mean for the left to take political action today? However, the issue of political parties seems to generate more problems for the left than it solves. Formalised political organisation would appear indispensable for long-term perspectives beyond the ebb and flow of movements. Yet the role of party in sustaining activity and discontents over time, of building towards a revolution, has had at best an ambivalent legacy, leading as much to rationalising politically ineffective strategies or giving cover for various forms of opportunism, reformism, careerism, etc. Today, the left of political parties as a means, today the idea of political parties as a means for the left, through which the necessity of social transformation could be developed within society, as opposed to an end in itself, is difficult to envision both theoretically and practically. Yet the existing default, politics without parties, seems unable to do more than give sanction to the vicissitudes through which capitalism changes but invariably persists. Worse still, without parties of its own, the left is forced to either passively or actively support or at least place hope in other parties. There appears no escaping the question of political party for the left. Okay, so I've asked speakers to respond to some of the questions we have in opening remarks. So I'll be giving speakers, I think, maybe 12 minutes each, since we've got 4 speakers, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for each speaker to respond to the other speakers and then open up for audience Q&A. So I'll start on the left with Nancy. Thanks.
Okay. I'll stand up. My phone lost connection, so I haven't got actually a copy of the questions in front of me, and if I go on, because I can actually bore myself and speak forever, just tap on the table.
Okay.
So, from memory, does the question of a party help or hinder the left? Well, we would argue in the Socialist Party that the question of a party is not just about hindering or helping, that is vital. Capitalism is a system based on classes, and the working class is not homogeneous. It's broken up along racial lines, along gender lines, sexuality, etc. And we would argue that one way that capitalism maintains its power is to exploit those differences. Oops.
Sorry.
Sit down.
Oh, thanks.
Just witness the way that UKIP became the establishment's anti-establishment party in the recent general election. How can a party which is so utterly anti-working class get nearly 4 million votes? The only way it can be explained is that capitalism aids and abets the differences that exist amongst the working class. And therefore we say that a workers' party has has to see as its first aim the necessity to unite the working class. And we only have history as a template, don't we? Regardless of what happened later on, the Bolsheviks managed to unite the working class and overthrew capitalism. Do we need a party? I would argue, yes, it's absolutely vital. We would argue that the working class needs a revolutionary party. I'm a member of the Socialist Party. But we have been campaigning for almost 20 years to build what we would call a new mass workers' party. And I've been particularly involved in helping to construct and stand for the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition. We stood 748 candidates in the recent general election. There were various parliamentary candidates. I was one in Walthamstow, and we stood in council seats. We polled over 118,000 votes, and we're very proud of that fact, because we believe that the working class, the absence of it having a mass workers' party, is debilitating it in all sorts of ways, whether you take the rail workers' dispute, whether you take occupations, whether you take zero-hour contracts, wherever you look, the lack of a mass workers' party is hindering the working class, and therefore we see our role as a dual task. We see our role as building a revolutionary party based on the ideas of Lenin and Trotsky, and at the same time helping to speed up events that are inevitably developing inside Unite, inside the FBU, a mass conversation taking place in society at the moment as to whether the Labour Party is ever going to get back into power. We would argue that's a vindication of our analysis 20 years ago, that the Labour Party no longer represented the working class, that it went over to neoliberalism, and under the blows of, if you like, external events like the 2008 crisis, it's been proved completely inept in its ability to unite the working class. Now, the second question was the problem with political organisation and the approach of, sorry, I haven't got them in front of me, but it was in reference to Occupy, yeah. Well, Occupy, in the Socialist Party, we saluted Occupy. Young people taking a stand against the whole system, not talking about this reform or that reform, but condemning the system and occupying the squares. And also putting to the forefront the idea that we, the working class, should pay for the crisis. It brought a fresh, new generation into politics. But while there was millions on the streets, there was also an anti, if you like, party political mood in the camps. I went to St Paul's and I was welcomed. I lost my job in the local library and I went to speak as someone who was a casualty of the crisis. But many socialists were associated with the history of Stalinism and were not necessarily made welcome in some of those camps, because the idea was the movement was enough, that you didn't need a political party, you didn't need socialists on the camp, you didn't need the old ideas, all you needed was the movement. But the Occupy generation has learnt some invaluable lessons, because even though the squares filled with anti-capitalist campers, particularly in places like Spain, what you witnessed was a mass movement of millions of young people dragging behind them the trade unions and the, if you like, the traditional left. And then in the following elections, the right wing assumed power and the pro-austerity parties gained. So therefore the questions was being asked, what do we have to do to fight austerity? Very quickly, new formations gained extra support, like the chair has said, Podemos and SYRIZA. And we gained. The Socialist Party went into the camps in Seattle. We recruited a young activist called Sharma Sawant. Many of you might know of her. She's now a city councillor in Seattle. And she gained 90,000 votes. And she's been a lightning conductor, if you like, for the Raise the Minimum Wage campaign, the Fight for 15, the movement of the low-paid workers, which has swept across the United States. Now, we can't gain absolute, we can't say that we're responsible completely for that, but we helped through getting a socialist elected in Seattle of raising this idea amongst the most oppressed layers of the working class, and we've actually won that. I mean, people talk about the fragmentation of the left and the defeats, but we've won that in Seattle. The minimum wage in Seattle is now $15 an hour. If you're a low-paid immigrant worker in McDonald's. That's a revolution in your life. That came out of Occupy. It was given a political stance, and we're very, very proud of that. Now, the next question was in regards to, do you have to be in a political party, or is, activism enough? And I would say that there is no movement in our history where political activism has overthrown capitalism. That's the fact. I'm involved in the health campaign, I'm involved in the trade unions, I'm involved as an anti-racist. In fact, my name's just gone up on Red Watch. My name and address has just gone up on Red Watch, which is a bit worrying because I live with my son. So the main point I want to make out of this is that there is no, if you like, we as the working class can't point to a movement in history where there's been a spontaneous uprising which has actually smashed capitalism, reorganised the state, implemented socialism and workers' democracy. The only template that we have of that is the Bolshevik Party. What was the next question? Sorry.
Just to let you know, you've got about 3 minutes.
Okay,
left.
I don't think we're going to get through it all.
Don't worry, we can come back.
So, are political parties fixed? And I would say no. Political parties can come and go. Parties serve the class forces of the time, and depending on their successes, history can either raise them or it can smash them against the rocks and discard of them. Witness what is happening to the Labour Party at the moment. I mean, what is happening to the Labour Party at the moment is very interesting because on the continent, social democracy was put in power, tested in power, and then discarded. What possibly we could be living through in Britain is a time where they're not tested in power, but they're tested in opposition, which raises the question, what if you're a trade unionist, a socialist, someone on the left, where do you go to fight for change? The next question was about states and the need for a party. I think I'll refer back to my first question. And is the need for a revolutionary party fixed? I mean, I would argue, yes, the need for a revolutionary party is absolutely fixed. That even now there's a deep questioning, particularly amongst the youth, of is this our future? 0-hour contracts, nowhere to live, education being shut down, no access into education. And there is already a deep questioning that we cannot reform this system, that we have to overthrow this system. So it inevitably leads us to what type of organisation do we have? This organisation has to have a programme, it has to have a revolutionary programme, it has to have a link to the masses, it has to be embedded in the trade unions, it has to be accountable to ordinary workers, it has to meet regularly, it has to have a programme which it puts at the time of heightened awareness. For instance, at the moment we're putting forward the idea of a 24-hour general strike to break this government and break austerity. And my last point, because the last question was in reference to the new formations, Podemos and SYRIZA. Very interesting what's going on. I'm sure lots of other people will have much more to say than I have. But one thing I would say is that TUSC based itself on building a new mass workers' party based on the trade unions. We want Unite, which has got its rules conference in July, to stop giving money to the Labour Party and fund their own political candidates. I mean, when I organised the local election campaign last year in Waltham Forest, I spent a year discussing with firefighters, tube workers, teachers, nurses. We stood a blanket slate of ordinary working class people against austerity, calling for socialism, and we got 5,500 votes across Waltham Forest. Now, we're not saying that we're going to take power, but we're saying we can't wait. We've got a lead, for example, in speeding up events, in arguing inside the FBU, for instance, at the moment, because there was a discussion inside the FBU at the moment that they should not back the Labour Party. Unite is under tremendous pressure. These are very exciting times, but I don't think we should throw out everything that we've learned from the past. We need to build on that. Our task is to build a revolutionary party, the Socialist Party, and to build a new mass workers' party in whatever formation that comes.
Jack has joined us. We'll bring you in at the end, Jack. I've been working down at the moment, so next up we've got Luke.
Unlike others on this panel and amongst the left, I do not consider myself to have a particularly strong grasp of leftist theory. My understanding and ideas about what the left is, who the left is, and what the left could be stem directly from my own experience. An experience that started when leaving the Labour Party age 15, leaving the Socialist Party and Socialist Workers' Party a few years later, and my recent experiences with the University of London occupations. Although I'm talking here because of my involvement with the Goldsmiths occupation, I by no means am a spokesperson to a movement that has no spokespersons. I'm here to talk about my own experience of leftist parties and networks. For me, the starting point is my experience with the Trotskyite left. I guess the role of the Trotskyite left party comes down principally and perhaps a little simplistically to organisation and education. I question now, therefore, how effective Trotskyite parties are in organising when working class life in this country no longer revolves around factory life and local trade union branches. It seems to me that the internet, social networking capabilities have changed the way political organisations and protest happen. I know that last year's large free education demo was organised following the cowardly backing out of the NUS between student networks and mostly online. Moreover, I would question the quality of a leftist political education that starts, first and foremost, with an opinion. My experience of Trotskyite parties is that the leftist curriculum had been set, that opinions and answers were already formulated for me to adopt rather than to challenge. One of the very first things that the Goldsmiths occupation did was to create a safe space policy. This was my first real experience of safe space politics, and I admit that at first I remained hesitant and cautious. I saw potential for notions of privilege and oppressive behaviour to perhaps shut down various debates. However, my experience turned out to be quite different. Safe space politics were the founding principles of our occupation. The occupation itself was a loose network of students dipping in and out of the struggle as we all balanced our daily lives and studies. The safe space policy enabled us to keep this ebb and flow, to resist permanent structures and to create the horizontal, egalitarian space that outside the doors of Deptford Town Hall could not offer. I thought to myself, we are only as powerful, as radical, as revolutionary outside in the world of struggle as we are equal, safe, and inside these walls. I guess, in its most simplistic form, this was utopia. Utopia starts by critiquing the world around us and envisaging solutions and answers. I believe this is where the power of horizontal networks lie, because we turn our backs on hierarchy and relations of power and create free, inclusive and safe spaces. I don't want to sound, however, like a utopian idealist. The safe space policy was not always efficient and unanimously successful. We argued and debated long into the night often. But this draws out another point. We were practicing democracy. I mean democracy in practice, not the barbarism and sham democracy of the world beyond our doors. Every day we actually practiced democracy, which, once more, felt like we were reclaiming democracy, redefining our own understandings of political education and political organisation. The safe space policy seemed to clear away all of the debris of failed revolutions and provide a blank slate for us to start again. Now, I don't want this to sound like we're disregarding the history of the left, but instead getting to grips with its successes and its failures. In the syllabus of safe space politics, nothing is assumed. Marx is not necessarily on the curriculum unless you put it forward and argue his case. Moreover, I think the safe space politics also came from a different theoretical starting point about who the revolutionary agent is. Too often, although not always, the revolutionary agent is the white, male industrial worker. Safe space politics equalises the playing field to all those oppressed groups: women's, trans, lesbian, gay, bisexual, ethnic minority and so forth. It felt to me that safe space politics offered the chance to democratise the revolutionary agent, whilst also starting with an understanding of, principally, the relationship between capitalism and oppression. I guess the question for me is, how can we create the utopian ideals of a post-capitalist world in our organisations today? What principles can we live, operate and activate by?
Michael?
Thank you very much. It is an honor and a privilege to address your meeting today. My talk deals with the following question. Do political parties today help or rather undercut the movement? I will therefore start by focusing on the current European political landscape, on the victory of SYRIZA in Greece, as well as the rise of Podemos in Spain, parties that constitute a great realignment in European politics that has become apparent over the last couple of months. On one hand, we can claim that this realignment came into place as a direct consequence of the existing crisis that is not only economic in character, as I have been saying during the past few years, but a crisis deeply political. It is a crisis that reflects also the gradual shift of the traditional center-left parties to the neoliberal ideology which became predominant in Europe after the 70s, being unable to address effectively a social agenda based on jobs and welfare. The most direct consequence of this ideology is a sharp humanitarian crisis in the European South, especially in Greece, with 25% of the population and the 50% of the young people being unemployed, whilst 1/3 of its population faces extreme poverty. However, we have to understand how such parties emerged. They emerged out of mass protests taking place both in Greece and Spain between 2010 and 2012. But the continuous de-radicalization and bureaucratization of SYRIZA and Podemos also up to an extent, its evident unwillingness to break with the Eurozone and the European Union, as well as its contradictory moves that clearly proclaim an unconditional surrender to the domestic oligarchies, pose serious questions regarding the future of the movements. This is because right now, the democratic demands of the mobilized masses are widely reflected through organizations that find themselves unable to implement radical policies. Organizations that also do anything possible to restrict the decision-making to a small group of experts who usually act behind closed doors. From this, it clearly follows that such parties do nothing apart from bestowing political action to bureaucratic leaderships, and once they backstab the movements and demobilize the society, as in the case of Greece and Spain, enhance the neoliberal hubristic illusion that a sociopolitical transformation constitutes a feckless idea. But even if we adopt the most reformist viewpoint, which claims that parties, trade unions, and other type of organizations ready to form a government sometimes offer tangible political platforms, or that such institutions will not wither away so quickly, and for these reasons we have to rely on them up to an extent. This logic excludes the importance of the concept of the political, that is, direct democracy and civic humanism, implying the transfer of most powers to councils, to open assemblies, restricting the domination of bureaucratic organizations. These are among the most crucial elements of emancipatory political movements that took place during the past few centuries, as Castoriadis was saying, like the labor movement and more precisely historical events on which the working class has been the main protagonist, like the Parisian Commune and the Spanish Revolution and so on. Movements that resulted to the gradual expansion of social and political rights. This consequently calls into question the illusion regarding the necessity of the party, which has been so much prized by the supposedly anti-capitalist New Left, denoting its inability to challenge the liberal capitalist paradigm, as long as it relies almost entirely on political representation, whose main spokesmen were Thomas Hobbes in 17th century England, the main philosopher of the bourgeoisie according to Hannah Arendt, and Jean Bodin in France respectively. Hobbes places his fundamental philosophical core upon the inability of self-governance, thanks to his essentialist understanding of humanhood as a defiant and disharmonious existence, empowered by an innate tendency to destroy everything in the pursuit of personal glory and felicity, denoting the necessity for human beings to rely on submission to coercive authority. Marxism, despite being among the first that identified the state with the autocracy of the bourgeoisie, at the same time fetishizes with avant-gardism and therefore with hierarchy. As a direct consequence, wherever Marxism came to power, not only the state never withered away, not only the proletariat did not impose its own program, but on the contrary, coercive elites emerged out of the process of placing the party of the working class to power, which in theory at least was regarded as a transitory period, imposing their dictatorship upon the proletariat itself. Reformist Marxist groups and leftist parties, such as SYRIZA and AKEL in Cyprus, are implementing the same dreadful neoliberal social deforms and not reforms, relying at the same time on the so-called charity economy that is providing only a tiny percentage of the national or global capital accumulation to the needy populations, offering thus nothing more but a supposedly humanized vision of liberalism. In addition, some Marxist thinkers like John Holloway argue about a global change without taking power, and this reminds us the anarchist Philistinism of power rejection, where power has become synonymous with force, which is also the central point of liberal philosophy, rather direct participation in the open public space. In fact, both Marxism and anarchism share some common ground with liberalism, especially when they acknowledge all social relations as strictly related to economic relations, ignoring entirely the concept of civic virtue, the most characteristic of all democratic movements, as aforementioned. Wasn't therefore Karl Polanyi right when he was stressing that economic liberalism misread the history of the Industrial Revolution because it insisted on judging social events from the economic viewpoint? In fact, he was. From the moment this particular standpoint fails to address holistical history in society, considering social change as something that goes hand in hand with economic transformation, then what follows is the total eviction of democracy, of civic republicanism, in other words, of what has been historically surfaced in the assemblies of ancient Athens, in the Roman Respublica, in the communes of medieval Europe, in the town hall meetings of New England, and of course, the revolutionary section of the working classes during the past 2 centuries. Civic republicanism should not be seen as something identical with urbanization, with a passive electorate, or with a constituency, as the liberal world understands it. On the contrary, it implies the existence of a real physical, participatory, interactive, self-reflective, and clearly observable entity. Civic republicanism, or else direct democracy, relies on commonality and friendship, the highest form of social solidarity, and constant self-reflection that fosters growth of a highly ethical intellectual insight through constant involvement in the public affairs. It is what we need, aiming to restore the organic sense of the common world. To achieve political, economic, and social equality, distinguishing at the same time virtue from vice, and to finally combat the reverting of the tribal, blood-tie racist folk philosophy which is projected by the atomized masses as an alternative to social fragmentation, issues that the parties of the new left have entirely failed to address. Thank you.
Simon.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm a kind of historian of Britain, and my reading of British politics over the last 30 or 40 years, I guess, has given me a slightly pessimistic view of the party political left, at least in the UK. But I hope that doesn't exclude a slightly more optimistic ending. But what I want to argue today is that there's been, since at least the 1970s, an ongoing threefold crisis of the left in Britain, and that particularly applies to various forms of party politics. So the first crisis of the left that has affected Britain and the wider world is the experience of what was called actually existing socialism in Soviet Russia, and that dates right back to the 1950s at least, when Khrushchev's secret speeches exposed what Stalin had been doing. It particularly dates to the crushing of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, when Moscow sent in tanks against a much more libertarian form of socialism within Hungary, and that was an event that led a third of the British Communist Party to leave the party almost overnight, in Britain. And the party never had the same reach here that it did elsewhere in Europe. Similar events were repeated in Czechoslovakia 12 years later. And the crisis of actually existing socialism, of course, ended in 1989, ended with the environmental catastrophe of the Soviet Union, the way that it lagged behind, at least in narrow economic terms, Western economies. So on the one hand, the first of my kind of threefold crisis of the left is the crisis of actually existing socialism and party political communism. Closer to home, there's secondly, there's a crisis of the social democratic left as well, and the way that relates to party politics. And this is tied up with the idea that there was a crisis of Keynesianism. You know, for many people on the left in the 20th century, the Labour Party, for often want of a better alternative, was the vehicle to socialism. And the assumption was that Keynesian economics could take them there. Andrew Gamble, the kind of Marxist political economist, wrote in 1979 in his early kind of take on what was to become Thatcherism, that we are living through a crisis that should never have happened. And what he meant was that Keynesianism was no longer doing the things that socialists and social democrats needed Keynesianism to do. Inflation was rising at the same time as unemployment, growth was stagnant. And that caused a real intellectual crisis for the party political social democratic left within the Labour Party. People like Anthony Crosland, for example, who wrote The Future of Socialism in the 1950s, relied on Keynesianism as the vehicle for growth. The question wasn't about growth, it was about how to redistribute the proceeds of that growth. It was about a fairer distribution not only of money but also of resources, of power, of opportunity, and so on. The collapse of Keynesianism in the 1970s was the second prong of the threefold crisis of the party political left in Britain. And even more profound, I think, is the third element I want to flag up. Now, I'm putting these in a pessimistic way. There are optimistic readings too. But there's also been a crisis of Labour, small l Labour, in the post-war period, continuing to this day. The Labour Party itself was set up largely by the organised working class. It was a trade union party. There were always kind of middle-class intellectuals involved, the Webbs and so on, but it was predominantly, from its earliest days, a party dedicated to the representation of the organised working class. And what there's been in Britain in the last generation in particular is a huge decline in manufacturing, and with that decline in trade union power. So, looking at this earlier, when Thatcher came to power in 1979 in the UK, manufacturing accounted for 30% of Britain's national income and employed nearly 7 million people. A couple of years ago it was down to 11% of the economy, a third of what it was, and a workforce of 2.5 million, about a third of what it was as well. So there's a huge decline in the kind of organised manufacturing industry that provided labour with its kind of sense of purpose in the 20th century. And not only that, you know, the jobs that labour relied on, public sector workers in particular, have changed. Government increasingly contracts out these jobs. Working for the public sector is often now working for a public service firm that looks like Serco, or, you know, if you're lucky, something from the third sector. But the idea of a highly organised public sector, highly unionised public sector, has also declined. You know, since 1980, the number of people within trade unions in Britain has halved. There's been a huge decline. So that's the kind of third prong of my kind of crisis of the party political left. You know, firstly, there's the crisis of actually existing socialism. Secondly, there's the crisis of kind of social democratic leftist politics. And thirdly, there's a crisis of kind of small L Labour, organised Labour. Now, one way to look at this would be that we're entering a kind of new, or have entered a kind of new period in history. Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, talks about a short 20th century, a period from around about the creation of the Soviet Union to its collapse, and a period within which politics is recognisably similar. There are continuities during that period. Politics on the left was based around the organised working class. socialism was recognisably a form of representation of working class people. And it might be that that's begun to collapse in various ways, and that's not entirely a bad thing. You know, it frees the left up to be more diverse, more pluralistic, to talk about other forms of oppression, oppression of women, oppression of minorities, oppression of people with disabilities, and so on. So that's my kind of sort of slightly pessimistic take, this kind of three-pronged crisis of the left. And I wanted to sort of finish by saying something a little bit more optimistic about, you know, what is to be done. Globally, we're in a very different position now. You know, globalisation has changed the world. We've got new challenges that weren't challenges that existed 70, 80 years ago. Challenges around nuclear war, challenges around global warming, challenges around companies being very able to move their money rapidly to tax havens where it can't be discovered, challenges about currency speculation. All of these things need concerted global effort, need organisation across nations in order to solve them. And there's, you know, plenty of signs in that. You know, from Seattle to Belo Horizonte, there are interesting things going on. The protest against the 1% are another interesting example of that. So mobilisation has to be global now. That's one of my sort of first more optimistic points. But locally, what we can do, or, you know, nationally, what we can do. Well, the left now, for the reasons I've sort of set out, is much more fragmented than it ever was before. You know, one of the failings of the left in the 20th century in Britain was it was largely about the representation of white working men. The left is much more fragmented, and it's the job of the left, in my view at least, to spend more time representing the various fragments that are oppressed or exploited in various ways. And that's what I thought Luke was very interesting there in talking about safe spaces where people could come together and talk about their different experiences. You know, that wasn't the politics of the 20th century. You didn't need a safe space if everyone around you was also a white working class man, and that's who you're trying to represent. And often the trade union movement, for all the good things it did, was also exclusive, was also male-dominated, and so on. So we need to look at ways of organising the fragments, and Luke's talked about some of those from his own personal experience there. And I think, you know, looking back, as I'm a historian, you know, I look back to the kind of the debates around at the start of the 20th century, which were much more pluralistic, much more diverse, which drew on a much wider group of thinkers, that drew on the early pluralists, people like G.H. Cole, as well as some of the more anarchistic or syndicalistic thinkers, Kautsky, even William Morris and so on. So, you know, there are plenty of interesting solutions, I think, in our past that we can return to. Thank you.
Okay, now, Jack.
Apologies for being late. So I didn't listen to all of what you said, so, you know, I won't better respond to everything you said there, Nancy. Okay, well, the first point I would say is that if you look at the left, there's an awful lot of comrades on the left that say they're in a party, an awful lot of comrades who say they were in a party, Socialist Party, Socialist Workers' Party. I'm in the Communist Party of Great Britain, but if you look at our paper, the first thing that it says in terms of what we stand for is that there's no political party of the working class. We happen to inherit the name. What's a party? Well, at least in terms of ordinary old Marxism, I think it comes from Latin, you know, in terms of the Marxist understanding, it means part of the working class. We are not part of the working class in terms of representing or organising anything that you could describe as a part. I listened to Nancy talking about the election results of TUSC, 700 and whatever the hell number of candidates, fantastic bloody effort that the comrades put in. And what did you get, 180,000?
118.
118,000. I mean, it's almost homeopathic, you know, in the sense that can you actually detect it when it comes to what the left got in the last general election. And in my own view, you know, if the comrades were standing on something that actually was genuinely radical, genuinely revolutionary, I could go, well, okay, maybe under a microscope I can detect it and maybe something can grow out of that. But the actual project of TUSC is a Labour Party Mark II. Christ's sake, comrades, we saw what Labour Party Mark I produced. I don't think Blairism was an accident. And I don't know any golden age when the Labour Party did represent the working class. As far as I can remember, my history, is it Simon, isn't it, Simon?
Yeah.
Simon will better tell us, you know, what was the Labour Party doing in World War I? Preaching workers should slaughter other workers. What was the first Labour government? I mean, did it dismantle the British Empire? Did it give, you know, did it give freedom to the colonies? No, it maintained it. What did the glorious Labour Party of Attlee do? Arm Britain with nuclear weapons and try to recapture, rebuild the British Empire. It knew that India had to go, but Christ, let's get our slice of the Middle East, let's get our new slice of Africa. So I don't recognise this glorious Labour Party of old that's betrayed us. It always was, to use an old Lenin phrase, a bourgeois workers' party. And what he meant by that, of course it's got workers in it, voting for it, sure. Who leads it, right? I mean, if we look at the leadership of the Labour Party, I mean, what a pack of rogues. I mean, they are capitalist politicians, no different to any other capitalist politician, at least in my view. Okay, I come from what I would describe as an orthodox Marxist position. And if I wanted to look back at history, well, my starting point actually wouldn't be the history of Great Britain. You know, in terms of my view, I agree with Nancy. You know, the highest example I've got to look to is the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, and all the rest of it. But where did the Bolsheviks get their ideas from? Where did they get their inspiration from? What was the purpose of the Bolshevik party and the revolution they carried out? It was not to build socialism in backward Russia. That was a joke, right? It was actually to spark the European revolution. And if that failed, quite frankly, we can talk about how it went wrong when it began to go wrong, but no serious Marxist should be surprised that it went wrong and produced a disaster. It could have been better, it could have even potentially been worse, but it had to be a disaster. It was a disaster. You could legitimately at least argue, you know, if the Bolsheviks had known that they weren't going to spark the German Revolution, they should have gone back, well, at least Lenin should have gone back to Switzerland. You know, looking at the disaster that was Stalinism, quite frankly, for the benefit of humanity, that's what he should have done, right? Okay, where do we stand now? The problem, in my view, is that the left is either trying to recreate a mythical golden age, i.e. in the form of Labourism, or the left in the form of Trotskyism and many other varieties of that, and I'd include official communism. We inherited the model that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were creating in the Third International that was designed for international civil war, which meant that the cadre and the rank and file of organisations that you've been in, you're in, I was in, were meant to be organised along military lines. Maybe justifiable in 1920, 21, 22. But in 2000, 2015, I mean, in the Socialist Party, right, Nancy will tell us, right, in the Socialist Party, and it's not unique to that. I've been in the old official Communist Party of Great Britain. It's true in the Socialist Workers' Party. It's true in all of the sects. If you've got a disagreement, it's against the rules to openly come out and say, I've got a disagreement. You're meant to keep it internal. So Nancy will not be able to tell us if there's been an argument, for example, on the Central Committee of the Socialist Party of England and Wales over whether TUSC is a great success or a disaster. Right? as long as the majority say it's a great success. Pardon?
I can tell you.
Of course, we know it's a great success. But what I want to hear, I don't mind. What I want to hear, and what surely people need, is the argument. And when I look back at the Bolsheviks, for all that was wrong with the Bolsheviks in terms of what they became, and they see, you can talk about when it went wrong, but when I read old Lenin's collected works, half of them, at least, and maybe I'm being not generous enough to him, consist of I disagree. Not with the Mensheviks, not with the socialist revolutionaries, but other people in the Bolshevik Party. I can read the minutes of their Central Committee. I can read the debates between one side and the other. So I know, when it came to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, that there were three sides on the Bolshevik Central Committee, and Lenin was in the smallest minority. Right? Why is that important? I think the two middle speakers, in their own, though I profoundly disagree with you, right? No, that's fair enough, but I think they've got something. How on earth, right, can you have an informed discussion when the leadership keeps their differences private, when they view themselves as some sort of elite, where they view themselves as people who bring liberation to the working class, right? I don't see how you can. To me, that would be like a scientist discussing the laws of relativity, sure. And did Einstein talk about the laws of relativity? As far as I know, he did. But then he keeps it quiet. He keeps it quiet in terms of the differences he has with other scientists. No scientists learn from other scientists by the clash of opinions. And that, in my view, is how the left needs to go forward. We need to be honest with each other. Surely that is the foundation of anything that we're going to get ourselves out of this. I don't think we're living in exciting times. I think we're living in disastrous times at the moment. I don't see the 118,000 votes, although I admire the effort that the comrades put in, as being the springtime for humanity. I regard that as being the last desperate breaths of a defunct and, quite frankly, deservedly buried left. So to pick up on that, the left is dead, long live the left. I think that's not a slogan I entirely agree with, but it is dying, and it deserves to die, the old left.
Thanks very much, Jack. Just to remind everyone, I'm going to let the speakers have a couple of minutes to respond to each other, and then I'll open up for audience Q&A, and I'll take questions in groups of 3 and then get the speakers to respond. And I'll just also say now we'll probably be heading to the New Cross House pub afterwards to continue discussion there, so you'll be welcome to join us. And yes, do sign up for the sign-up sheet as well if you have to leave early before we finish. Okay, so I'll start again with Nancy, and we'll just give a couple of minutes to respond.
Well, first of all, I defend the idea of the Revolutionary Party organised around democratic centrist lines. I think that, as I said in my opening contribution, the only template we have of an organisation, a revolutionary party taking power, smashing up the state and introducing things like an 8-hour day for the working class, which I work in the teachers' union, and on average a teacher today is working 70 hours a week. So for them to have legislated an 8-hour day to liberate the most oppressed people to participate in revolutionary life, in discussions like this, in their own Soviets, in their communities, and to take control of society, I think that is something that I would defend. Democratic centrism recognises that we are up against the state with all its machinery, with the media, with the police and the judiciary, and the huge obstacles that the working class has to face to fight against that state. And therefore, it's the ultimate in democracy, in internal discussions and disagreements. Like we had big disagreements with our Scottish comrades when they wanted to leave our organisation, and we said to them, no, stay within our organisations. There's not a history inside the Socialist Party of expulsions. We wanted them to stay and discuss with us, and stay discussing with us within the perimeter of the Socialist Party. I'm not a fantasist. I don't want to say that the 400 votes I got in Walthamstow are the start of the workers' militia in Walthamstow. I'm not about to say that and to lie to the meeting today, but everybody here has discussed the crisis of political representation of the working class. This is not a parlour game, it's not a day out, this is a serious discussion that we have to resolve the problems that are facing the working class today. And it's not just us saying it. I didn't have time in my opening contributions, but in July, inside Unite, the £3 million that goes to the Labour Party is under discussion. Where are they going to put that money? Are they going to fund their own candidates and stand independently? And maybe try and mimic along trade union lines what is happening in SYRIZA, what is happening in Greece and in Spain. What is this? Is this the love of the distance? As long as it's going on over there, then we salute it. But if we try and grapple with those questions here, all of a sudden it's ridiculous. No. These questions are the order of the day, and inside the Post Office Workers Union, in the Teachers Union, at the FBU this year, the biggest fringe meeting was the TUSC meeting. We're not about to say that we're the finished article. It's something we're campaigning for. We say the TUC has to formulate a new mass workers' party. The Bolsheviks worked inside the Social Democratic Labour Party, and they only called themselves the Communist Party when they took power. They understood that amongst the working class, the influences of capitalism meant that they had to have a broad formation where they were discussing their programme. They didn't stand independently, they stood within a broader formation. The lack of that representation, as has been expressed, you know, I agree with the comrades when you say about the faults that they've embraced neoliberalism, but nevertheless, this is a very sort of frustrating period because millions of people across Europe are sort of grappling with these ideas. That's why you've raised them here tonight. They're very real and they're in front of us and people are trying to resolve them. What type of party? Is it okay to have assemblies and have primaries, if you like they've got in Podemos? Is that democratic? Is it more democratic to do what the Labour Party did, for instance, where Keir Hardie went around the Lanarkshire miners, collected the dues and said, I'm your man in Parliament, I'm answerable to you. In 1967, I want to come back on the point that the comrades at the end made, but then in 1967, a motion was passed at a local Labour Party branch to stop the then Labour government putting boots on the ground inside Vietnam. That went to Labour Party Conference nationally, and it was a trade union resolution, and they stopped the intervention inside Vietnam. Now compare that to 2003, when the Labour Party was split down the middle, when the whole of society was in turmoil against the intervention in Iraq. There was no unanimity. Society was torn apart by it, and yet you couldn't stop the slide of the Parliamentary Labour Party going to war. What was the influence in 1967? It was the influence of the trade unions. Now I agree with you, we need a revolutionary party inside a broader mass, but you're going nowhere, comrade, as your little sect outside of the general Labour movement. Yes, TUSC is not the finished article, and the Socialist Party doesn't claim to be a mass revolutionary party. But in my history, we organised the mass campaign that defeated the poll tax. In my history, we organised the working class in Liverpool, which built 5,000 council houses, leisure centres and parks. I've got a history where my party relates to the working class, wins reforms and builds, and that's what we need to do. The future is not pessimistic. The next generation is more revolutionary than anything that's gone before us, and they're grappling with these ideas, and rightly so.
Come back and thanks.
I don't want it to feel like we're ganging up on the SP, but I actually stood when I just turned 18 for TUSC in the local council election in Lincoln, which is where I'm from, and I got 115 votes, and it was at that point that I realised that was this really where power comes from. I was stood in a stuffy room with all of these careerist bureaucrats who have been in the council for years and years and years, and I was going, right, is this where power lies? Or is power somewhere beyond that, somewhere beyond the elected councillors, somewhere beyond Parliament? And then it also got me thinking, well, actually, turnout in my area that I stood was 30%. So actually 70% of people didn't even turn out, and I think that itself is an indictment of where the left and where TUSC is at. But when I joined TUSC, I almost consciously thought to myself that in joining this organisation, I give up some of my own ability to be critical and free and to read what I want to read. And there was a point where I had disagreements with my comrades, and I wrote on a blog post a disagreement with the official party line, and I ended up having discussions, and I guess being told off. And I look back on that and I go, was that worth it? Was me giving up my freedom to have my own opinion and to challenge the party line worth it for standing in a council election that got 5% of the vote, what I did? And I thought, actually, maybe this organisation hasn't got its finger on the pulse. And then I directly compared that experience with TUSC to, I guess, the student movement now. And I don't think the Goldsmiths occupation stood alone in what it was trying to achieve. We followed on from the Canadian students who in 2010 led a fabulous occupation, to the occupation of Amsterdam University that went on at the same time, and we had some comrades from that occupation come and help set up ours. From the occupation of the University of Cape Town, which also went on at the same time, that had race relations at the very heart of its occupation. And it felt like that student movement was fluid and flexible, and they weren't prescribing any answers or claiming that we have the answers. And I guess that is at the core of what I mean when I talk about utopian principles within our organisation now. It's the commitment to principles about open discussion and debate, and to coming to terms with what the left has been in order to move forward about where the left is going.
Okay. One thing that I agree with all of you is that I disagree with most of you, but we do share some common ground finally. You've been speaking about disagreements within the party. I think SYRIZA is a crucial point, because right now in Greece, if you just open any blog, any news network, you will find 3-4 different opinions within the party of SYRIZA in regards to the negotiation with the EU. Some, the most left platform basically, they say we want to get rid of the EU once and for all. Others say, okay, let's go step by step. But this is a very good point basically, because disagreements saved the party from many threats. Some, our finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, who is a brilliant academic for me, despite I disagree with him, has hired a person to negotiate with the IMF, a person who is very neoliberal in ideology. And many people from the party openly voiced their disagreements, so that this person has said, okay, I don't want to collaborate with you because of this. Actually, this is very, very important, because it saved the negotiations from a dreadful mistake. But let's see that the same happens in your party, the same happens in your party. If these parties begin to grow and reach the second point, become second, even reach the position to become the largest party of Britain, do you think that they will stick with their commitments, or they will actually begin to reflect the neoliberal ideology? Because right now Greece is heading towards a third memorandum, and it's going to be even worse than the first and the second. Even more cuts. So it's very, very difficult to propose a rupture with a neoliberal established order if you don't have support from the people, and if the people do not put pressure for changes.
Thank you. We'll come back again.
Yes.
Okay. Well, lots of interesting contributions. Jack was a very powerful speaker. Although the notes I took were, we should disagree, the left is dead, which I'm not sure was the take-home point. I want to focus on a couple of things that Nancy said, because I thought that was very interesting, particularly the kind of historic link between trade unions in Britain and Labour. Because I thought it was ironic that the point she gave about when trade unions have been successful was over Vietnam, when trade unions pressured the Labour Party not to follow the United States into war. Then they were very successful. You know, so it's actually unions working with Labour that can be successful. And I want to just sort of flag up the consequences of following through with the push to break the Union-Labour link, it would mean almost certainly that the Conservatives are in power for perhaps a generation. You know, this term alone, they are committed to £12 billion of cuts to welfare. It's going to be brutal if they're struggling in Britain over the next few years. That would continue for a long time. The Labour Party would become a kind of second Conservative party if they're not already. I mean, what struck me as very interesting as well, is what I'm interested in is kind of new forms of solidarity. I talked about the forms of solidarity that dominated the 20th century, particularly around trade unions and so on. And there's lots of examples here that come up of people doing interesting things, working together in various ways. And you know, I'm very interested in the way that kind of technology allows people to communicate. The role of technology, for example, in the protest against autocracy in the Middle East and North Africa, and the way in which new forms of solidarity between groups can grow up in the kind of 21st century, that might form the basis for a kind of new or newer left.
Just a couple of.
Tell me when to shut up.
Yes, just a couple, 2 minutes.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks. Well, I'm absolutely firmly committed to a party. I heard some of what Nancy said as I tripped over, as I came in. I think you're talking about structures and continuity, and in that sense, deep organisation, solidarity. You know, I've been an organised member of a party since I was about 13, right? And yes, what you get on the left, it can be admirable in the sense that I know I can rely life or death on comrades. That's a very powerful feeling, and it's a necessary thing that we need to have if we're going to take on the capitalist class and win, in my view. So I believe we need a party. I don't think movements, I don't think protest is enough. I think that they're great, but if we're going to do the job, we need something far more. Okay, Nancy, just a bit of history. Democratic centralism, where does it come from? As I understand it, this is not a Russian invention. It comes from German social democracy. And basically, what it was invented for is against the right wing. And they did expel people. They didn't expel enough, right? They should have expelled their right wing. That's my view. Democratic centralism does not mean, though, keeping your mouth shut. It means unity in action. Well, that's a difference, because Nancy quoted to us Scotland. I knew all about militant Labour, I think it was at the time, because someone was passing their internal bulletin to us. So I was in a privileged position. Nancy was in a privileged position. The rest of us, except if you read the Weekly Worker, didn't know anything about it. Nancy, you were in something. Your dad, I presume, you know, it must be Peter, right? Peter Taaffe split, right, with the founder of Militant Tendency. Do you know where it was announced? Do you know where it was fought out? Not in the pages of Militant, their paper, their weekly paper. It was in The Guardian. Why not in the pages of Militant? Why not? If you talk about the Bolsheviks, your history is wrong. The Bolsheviks did not operate in the RSDLP. They were the RSDLP. Did they stand independently from the Mensheviks? Yes, they did. Read some history. They won the entire workers' vote in terms of the Tsarist parliament in 1912 as the Bolsheviks, right? So just get some history, please.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
No, you should learn some history.
Comrades, please. Okay. So I'm going to open up for Q&A now. I'm going to exert the right as moderator to ask the first question, and then I shall take another couple. I shall bring the speakers back in and then take some more. I just want to question a little bit more about the party form. We've had various kind of sort of discussion going back and forth about some people, Jack and Nancy, feel that the party is the form that's needed in order to take power, and I'm just not quite clear from some of the others on the speaker on the panel whether the form of the party has significance in terms of taking power, or what it means to take power at all for you guys. And I guess also just a little bit more clarification between perhaps what a movement might be versus a party, and even what an uprising might be as opposed to a movement, because could we actually consider some of the uprisings in 2011 as actually having a continuity with even today? Was it in fact an uprising? Do we actually have even a movement, a left movement as such? So those are my questions. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would fundamentally question the idea of TUSC as Labour Party Mark II, whether in reality or in formation. Because, I mean, the whole idea of the Labour Party as the bourgeois workers' party, yes, it's true, Lenin did say that, but in effect, the Labour Party has a dual character. Until very recently, it did have a mass working class base, and significant reforms were going for the working class. There was a whole tranche of very significant reforms that emerged out of 1945. So there is that. But it's bourgeois in that although those things happened, it was still committed to capitalism. And I think this is one of the fundamental reasons why it capitulated to neoliberalism. Now, TUSC is not Labour Party Mark II. True, as with the Labour Party, it's based on the trade unions, and it is correct to look at the formation of a new mass workers' party, since the Labour Party no longer fits the bill. But as TUSC grows, we will struggle increasingly against reformism, because there will be reformist elements that will join TUSC, and we have to struggle against those reformist elements, because clearly we know that capitalism isn't working and it is not going to work. So, I mean, that is something that, you know, we have to make very clear. I think the way I can illustrate it is that
Can I get you to wrap up? Just a couple of...
Yeah. I mean, basically, I saw the film The Spirit of 45, and it was very significant because one of the miners there was talking about the nationalisation of the coal mines, obviously, which was a big step forward. But what he wasn't impressed by was the fact that former mine owners were sitting on the coal ball. Now, clearly, you know, when renationalisation does occur, I mean, what TUSC will be fighting against is that kind of scenario occurring again. I mean, what we're looking at is nationalisation without compensation unless there is a proven need, and workers, not the former mine owners, but workers actually on the board. And these will be people who will be instantly recallable, because obviously we don't want the formation of an entrenched bureaucracy. So I think essentially these are the things that TUSC will be fighting against. And if the Socialist Party within TUSC is victorious in that, we will not be having TUSC as Labour Party Mark II. It will be a genuine mass workers' party that will play its part in the working class eventually taking power here and elsewhere.
Thank you. I'll take... Yes.
Okay. So I have two questions for Luke. So you implied that the Marxist left has more debris, quote unquote, in its history than the kind of anarchist or direct democracy left. And I think you actually predicated the concept of safe space upon a, I guess, more historically blank slate. And so can you address 2 points on this subject that were actually raised by Nancy and Simon? So the first is that, as Nancy noted in her remarks, the great victories and defeats in the history of the left have largely been like on the Marxist left. And maybe it could be even said that deeper defeats could only have arisen from, I guess, like less farcical failures or for greater opportunities of victory. So this first question is, do you believe that the defeat of, for example, anarcho-syndicalists in Spain, or any other example you can give me of defeats of this more direct democracy and kind of anarchist type, do you believe that they are as rich for like learning from? What can you point us to, in history? And then secondly, Simon mentioned that there's a greater apparent global character of capital today, and hence this sort of brings forth the possibility for a more global emancipatory struggle. And so how are safe spaces, which actually in my experience are much more authoritarian than I would have imagined the Leninist minutes of whatever to be, so how are these safe spaces actually scalable to this vision? Are they substitutes for, are they leadership of, are they to be yoked to, are they supplementary to this kind of struggle for an organized effort at global power?
So we've got, I'll bring the speakers back in now, and then I will take Toby's question next round. So who would like to speak first? Maybe
I can speak a bit, but if they want to
Luke,
address the question first.
Maybe I'll take Luke first, and then.
Okay. In terms of learning from history, I don't think it's. I don't think there's any difference from learning from the history of failed Marxist struggles and also failed anarcho-syndicalist struggles or failed any forms of left. I think it's important that we learn from all of them and see the limits from all of them. I know the safe space policy has inherited a tradition of really open debate, and I know that comes with its own problems, and I know that we have actually had, in terms of building the Free University of London, we've had lots and lots of issues, and practically, in terms of actually getting stuff done, trying to organise something like the Free University of London is really tough, and we're not there. But I think the cost of it is worth it. I think the cost of being, at this point in time, slightly sluggish and not quite getting into our rhythm, I think the cost of that is the quality of our organisation and making sure that we are as radically egalitarian as possible. But I also understand that the proof, I guess, is in the pudding with this one, with how the Free University of London will continue to kind of sustain itself without elected positions or without elected roles and this kind of loose network. And I can only base that on my own experience of being involved with the Free University of London. And in terms of your second question, which I think was in regards to the safe space, any chance you could repeat that?
Oh yeah. So, so if the character of capital today is in fact a global character, what is the role of this safe space kind of form of organization in in an effort that is taking that kind of global power to be its object? Mm-hmm. So how are these safe spaces scalable to a global politics, to a global emancipatory struggle? Or are they, what's their role? Are they the leadership of the struggle? Are they to be supplemented to this?
I guess I'm not sure. I think I'm going to say I'm not particularly sure. I definitely see a return to a kind of more localised organisation as a remedy to what's going on in terms of globalisation. I also think that the nature of where capitalism has developed means that I'd probably go along with the whole multitude empire thing. I think capitalism has sort of almost transcended the nation state now. It's supranational, it's transnational, it's running alongside national governments. So I think we also need to operate in networks and global organisations. Like what they look like, I don't have a clue, I guess. And in regards to the first question as well, if I can come back on that as well, about taking power, I go back to my issue of the nation state. What would taking power look like? If you seize Westminster, if you seize the national government, what can you actually do with that power? How much power actually does the nation state have now when so many organisations run above and beyond and next to the state? And then I also question, do we want to take power? Is power something that is ideal that we want to achieve? Do we want to be structured by power, or is there something else? Is there an anti-power? Is it possible to create a space that is not that? And I know, I guess, essentially these are more questions, but I also think they're important questions.
Okay, so maybe they can be posed to the other panellists. So, I mean, could I get... Actually, Wentai, your question related a little bit to what Simon was saying too, so maybe I'll get Simon and then Michael and then Jack and Nancy.
Okay. Actually, I wasn't going to answer Wentai's question on those because I think Luke's done it, and like Luke, I don't have an answer necessarily. Instead, I've got an anecdote about nationalisation, responding to your point there. Sorry, your name? Susanna. Does anyone know the Thomas Tank Engine stories? Written by Reverend Audrey in the 1940s about a little train company. And he wrote them during the 1940s, obviously, when the railways were nationalised. And in the early stories, Thomas the Tank Engine was run by someone called the Fat Director, the guy there with the top hat on, that man. In the later stories, he became the Fat Controller, but he was still the same man. I think that's just something very profound about some of the kind of limits of the kind of post-war approaches to nationalisation. The power relations stay the same, and what matters if you can do that kind of thing is you challenge the power relations, you get workers involved, and so on. On your your point about what is a political party for, I'm very interested in people like Hilary Wainwright, for example, who write about political parties as umbrella movements that can encompass a whole variety of movements within them and open themselves up to far more democracy than anything you see in contemporary mainstream party politics, at least. But that kind of red-green approach is very interesting.
Yes, you mentioned about the Spanish Revolution. It's a subject that I've been researching for years, and I have referred to the Spanish Revolution in my text. So the concept of learning from history, there are two different perspectives here. One perspective says that we have to reflect on history and see what went wrong and try not to repeat the same mistakes again. But on the other hand, you have also another perspective saying that a historical event like the Spanish Revolution, for example, it's not a model. So the anarchist Catalonia, let's say, or the Soviet example, it's not a model that we should copy for today, and therefore the challenge that we have in what we're going to build would not be the same in comparison to the challenge the Spanish Revolutionists had during that time. From my point of view, we have to merge. We have to merge these two different perspectives and try to reach a common ground in order to see what we can do. I found out also that I agree with many with Luke in regards to localization versus globalization. And now, taking power. Do we want to take power? Yes, we do want to take power. What is power? Power is not force. Power is, what we actually do here is to discuss in an open public space. So we have to get rid of the liberal perception that power is force, whose main spokesman was, again, Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher of the bourgeoisie. We have to get rid of this idea. I think and we have to rethink about the whole concept of power, left, revolution, and moving forward, taking the good ideas from the past and go ahead. So.
Okay, I'll bring in Jack now and then have Nancy.
Okay. Well, just picking up on what some of the other panellists have said, it does strike me, personally, when I hear this phrase globalization, I sort of say to myself, well, the globe has always been a globe for a start. We've always lived on it. And the idea of capitalism suddenly in the 21st century becoming global really strikes me as very peculiar, because when I look back at Marx's Das Kapital, when I look back at history, what I see is capital, right, beginning as something that was never tied to the nation state. Always it's reached out and always it's existed on a global level. Hence, for me, as a Marxist, the revolution precisely cannot be just going down to Westminster, seizing power and say, right, now we've got Westminster and we're going to then introduce utopia, right? The Marxist has always said we've actually got to transcend capitalism at where it fundamentally exists. And it's always existed fundamentally at a global level. Hence, any view, in my view, of socialism in one country national paths, or for that matter, maybe throwing a bit of pebbles in your direction, or attempts to create some utopian little space somewhere and liberate its own, however necessary sometimes in terms of an occupation or this or that, is quite clearly utopian in the 19th century terms. It is, or the original term, it's a nowhere, it doesn't exist. I mean, in terms of genuine liberation, as a strategy, it's going to get us nowhere. So for me, we have to take power on a global level. We have to liberate ourselves on a global level. I don't view that as a 21st century discovery. I think it's a good old-fashioned 19th century piece of Marxism.
Well, I don't think you get more local than a trade union branch. You know, every workplace in this country could potentially have a trade union branch, which, you know, is the ultimate expression, if you like, in organising locally. And I don't think we have to throw that model out because, you know, it is... See, nothing works in this country without the working class making it work. And if they stop working, then they have the capacity to paralyse the banks, you know, the tubes. Everything would stop. I mean, when the tube workers go on strike, people feel the power of this small group of people, like the whole of London's paralysed by this small group of people. And what it does, what the strike does, is it reveals the power in society. And a small trade union branch can paralyse the wheels of industry. And that's why the revolution has to be based on the organised working class. I think this question came up, didn't it, about, I think you raised it about the way that Podemos is organised and SYRIZA is organised, because that, I mean, I'll return to it. That's one of the reasons. That's one of the things we say. We say that this idea of horizontal organisation, of networks, etc. It's a nonsense that you don't have leaders, because you do have leaders. But the thing is, they're not accountable and they're not elected. And we've been through, you know, I'm not saying that Russell Brand, you know, it epitomises everything about that sort of style of organisation, but he came out with some slogans and he captured the public imagination and people invested in him, you know, this capacity to speak for the next generation. And then, you know, on the eve of the general election, he comes out and says, you know, Owen Jones basically offers up his scalp to the rest of society and says, you know, Russell Brand's going to endorse a vote for Labour. And all of his fans, I mean, I watched the Truths the next day, all of his fans are like incredulous. How could you betray us, Russell? And that's what's going on inside SYRIZA. That's what's going on inside Podemos. They've got leaders who are working within the framework of capitalism. There's a very interesting film on the internet about when SYRIZA went to the Dockers, and you probably would like this because they're all old Communist Party members and traditionally they support the Communist Party, and the SYRIZA is trying to get the vote in the election there, and there's a big Barney going on, and eventually they do win the support of those Dockers. But the point is, the difference between SYRIZA and, say, the old Labour Party here, and perhaps what the Communist Party became, is there was accountability between those Dockers and their political party. And now, that film on the internet is Cyprus going to those Dockers saying, we're not going to privatise the port. Well, we all know they're going to privatise the port. Where's the accountability between those Dockers and the leaders? And my very last point, because I didn't manage to come back to it earlier, is this idea of a globalised world and the working class looks different. It's no longer white and, white and middle-aged. The working class is bigger now globally than it's ever been. Might not look the same, but the drag towards the city, the urbanisation of the world means that the working class is bigger. Might be in service, might be like my grandmother who was in service in London, cleaning the houses of the rich. Our kids now are pulling coffee for the hipsters, but it's the same working class. It's no different. It's there. You just have to seek it out and organise it. And as I said, the fast food movement in America is electrifying. These are the poor, the most oppressed, and people wouldn't even class them as working class. And they're on the move, and they're winning. So I don't agree with you. You know, it isn't all doom and despair. I think that the privatised public services, there's a great capacity in Serco, in Royal Mail, in the industries, in the health services, some magnificent struggles in London of poor African cleaners in my area, in Whipps Cross, who fought against their privatised cleaning company for decent pay. And it will be expressed in a different way, but it will be no different to new unionism of the 1880s that came up from the docks. The matchstick girls, they weren't the classical craft union people, so people dismissed them. Now those unions are the unions we base ourselves on. So, you know, 6 million people in the trade unions. There's 5 million now who are officially classed as the precariat. Those people with temporary jobs, casual jobs, people like my daughter who's a window cleaner who is self-employed. I mean, how can you be self-employed? Window cleaner, it's only a way of getting her off the dole statistics and making sure that, you know, that she lives on a sort of impoverished wage. These are the new working class, and we have the capacity to organise them. And that is my point.
Thanks. Okay, so I'll take some more questions. There was one down here.
Yeah, okay. The first thing was Nancy's taking words out of my mouth, because I was going to talk about the fact the class is still there. It's black, it's female, it's gay, it's all sorts of things, but it's still there. And the working class is everyone who works for wages. They may not work in a mine or steel works, but the class is still there. And Nancy's made that point very eloquently. In defence of TUSC, I'm not going to defend TUSC totally, but in defence of TUSC, their party political broadcast, the candidates showed that. I think everyone was waiting for just Dave Nelson, who's going to ban TUSC as, you know, white male trade unionist dinosaurs. There were black people, there were women, there were young people, there were Asian people. You know, there was a wide range of, and it was shown there. And I mean, within the University of London, I always think about the Latin American cleaners, often here illegally as well, and they fought back. It is possible to fight back, and people do. And the class exists, and I would call it a proletariat. I would reject the Negri thing of the multitude completely. I'd also, in that context, say, look, on horizontalism and so forth, that this, in fact, was criticised back in the early 70s by an anarchist feminist woman called Jo Freeman, who wrote a brilliant short piece called, what is it? The Tyranny of Structurelessness. Yes. And this, I've experienced it myself, both in attempts of working with sort of semi-autonomous type movements around the European Social Forum in 2010, 2011, you know, and I suppose I briefly popped into the Goldsmiths occupation. And I've also experienced it, to be honest, in something that's registered as a political party that I'm part of, People Before Profit. The moment you have this consensus decision-making, it's actually manipulated by leaders who are not accountable. I'd much rather have votes and leaders who you could vote in and out, and decisions that are made by show of hands. I really don't think this is the way to go. And though I understand where the safe spaces thing comes from, because of the horrendous stuff that went on, particularly within the SWP and the Martin Smith stuff and all that, but and I would say you've got a right, I think, to silence people who make racist or homophobic statements amid occupation. But when people are selling Nancy's newspaper, get kicked out of the Goldsmiths occupation, as I believe they were, because some Labour Party member found it offensive to see a copy of the Socialist, I think this is taking it to ridiculous extremes. Look, I mean, I would defend it within limits. I've defended Baha on Facebook. I haven't said anything against Baha on Facebook. I've actually defended her on Facebook. But it gets carried to extremes, this. So, which brings me to Left Unity, of which I am a member, sorry, I know him as John, but Jack anyway, is on the National Council, but didn't mention Left Unity. Now, what I want to say in relation to Left Unity is quite simple, actually. It's in relation to the Greater London elections. It's a question of sense to both Jack and to Nancy. I do think it would be much more sensible for the Greater London elections if there was a united left slate that involved both TUSC and Left Unity. Because to me, we would only give the Life of Brian impression to the wider world if there is two left slates contesting that. But I do, in a sense, believe something from below. I would say absolutely no track with George Galloway or anything like that. That guy is a complete and utter shit. I'm on record as calling him a zombie in the latest issue of the paper, that in a letter, the latest issue of the paper, a flesh-eating zombie. I could call him worse.
Thanks, Toby.
Yeah, okay.
That's great. Any other questions from back over here? Over here, yes.
Just very quickly, I think addressed to Michael.
Yes.
Just two things that you said that I was really interested in.
Can you reply to the first and then you can ask the second?
Or let him ask the things.
Just two things that you said that I was interested in, and I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit more on, or whether any of the other panellists could voice disagreement with or engage with a bit more. You said, you were sort of saying, do we want to take power? Well, and I also, I've not actually noted down the context of when you said, do we want to take power? But section. And along with the kind of form of political organisation that you're advocating, at that point, no conception of who we, the pronoun we could be, who is we, let alone do we want to take power. Essentially, I'm saying, like, what is, how can we conceive of a we with more horizontal structure of organisation? And then secondly, this conception of progressing beyond the idea of moving forward. So it seems to me that you're talking about almost a new kind of historical understanding upon which to base politics. Could you say a bit more about that, and I question whether that would have to necessitate a new kind of understanding of what learning is and what being is. I don't know.
I have something else to ask that's maybe related to a little bit of both those questions, which comes back to the question of representation. David was asking about the we. And we've been talking quite a lot about the working class, actually, and other types of representation of minorities, the poor, the marginalised. What does it mean, I guess, for an organisation to be representative? Is it about is it representative in terms of a set of ideological values, or is it in terms of one's identity, or as much as one can I create a particular kind of identity? So something about representation, and I guess a bit more of an understanding from all the panellists what they would understand of the working class. What does the working class mean? And also, I'm actually now unclear whether all the panellists. I know that Nancy and perhaps I know that the three on this end of the table are wanting to overcome capitalism. I'm not sure about you guys. I don't know. That's the political agenda. So I think. Oh, we'll have Michael first.
So, in regards to taking power, who is the we in horizontalism? I'm afraid I don't speak about horizontalism. I don't fancy the idea of horizontalism. My concept is called civic republicanism, or else direct democracy. And it's wrong to associate democracy with horizontalism. It's wrong to say that horizontalism is the same with equality and freedom. In fact, totalitarianism can also take place even without a leader. So oppression doesn't require always a leader. Civic republicanism, or else direct democracy, is based on isonomia. Do you know the word?
Insomnia?
Okay. Isonomia. It's
sorry.
isos and nomos from the Greek. which means equal before the law, but not as the liberals understood it. Not in the sense that you're equal before a law that somebody else has imposed on you. It means that you're equal in creating laws, in participating in the body politic in order to create a law. And also, isagoria, another Greek word, isos and agoro, to have the same capacity to speak as everybody else, and obey the same rules that you create at the same time. This is the idea of the authentic idea of democracy, because what we have nowadays is not democracy. And the horizontal example of the anarchist theory, for me, it's like it's nonsense. So I don't even think that this concept has anything to say. So for me, power is isonomia and isagoria. That means that we, the people, the political body, call it as you want, the working class, use as many euphemisms as you want, should be equals between ourselves and between institutions that we create. We do not bestow power to somebody else. We have the upper hand. If we need political parties, if we need to have some structural organization, the councils, the political bodies should have the upper hand in the decision making. That's the concept. Horizontalism is something I can't really imagine. It never took place anywhere. Even in the Spanish Revolution that you mentioned, and I mentioned it as well, there used to be trade unions. So I'm sorry if I'm touching a sensitive nerve. Now, I didn't understand the second question. I'm sorry. But do you want to repeat it again so the other speakers can reply to other questions, and then we can...
I understood, maybe I understood you wrong, but I thought that you were implying that we need a new conception of learning from the past.
Yes, but in my point, in my perspective, there is no such a thing as a new conception. There is no birth of or origin in terms of understanding politics. All the concepts and ideas we create are borrowed from the past. It sounds a bit Foucauldian, but it's not Foucauldian. So, yes, we do need some different understanding in comparison to liberalism, which is also reflected through Marxism and anarchism. But I don't think that this is something, a new discovery. So a little bit from Aristotle maybe will make you think differently. So some thinkers like Murray Bookchin, Castoriadis, Hannah Arendt. So just to give you my point of view, basically. Okay.
Simon.
Well, I mean, the first question about class was interesting. I certainly didn't mean to imply that class isn't a crucial category in understanding our time. And what Nancy said and this gentleman said about the changing nature of class has been really important, I think. What's obviously happened on the mainstream left, I guess, in Britain in the 20th century was that the organised working class has changed. That level of organisation isn't nearly as strong. Working class isn't as unionised around manufacturing in a way it was. But of course, the huge element of the service industry, the working class still exists, still a crucial category. And one of the interesting questions for the left now is how you can organise, mobilise groups that are in some ways out of reach. Like your daughter, who's a great scam at the moment, pushing people who might perhaps have been out of work into declaring themselves as self-employed. Just to get them off the books. How do you reach out and mobilise the thousands of people in that position? You asked a question about whether I want to overthrow capitalism as well. And I guess, I am more centrist than other people on this panel. That doesn't mean I don't consider myself to be radical in some ways. I think to understand society, you need to understand the nature of capitalism. I think it's very difficult to come up with a coherent way of talking about the overthrow of capitalism that doesn't open yourselves up to many of the dangers that we saw in the 20th century, where groups did try to overthrow capitalism and it went horribly wrong in various ways, as we saw in the Soviet Union. So I guess I'm more pluralistic, more open to experimentation, mobilisation, and looking at ways in which liberty, in a much broader sense than just kind of economic liberty, but forms of autonomy can matter to people. And you might find that through organisation, through mobilisation, through people trying different things, that we end up with something that doesn't look like capitalism.
In terms of a definition of class, of a revolutionary subject, I agree. I guess in essence with Toby's definition of the proletariat, but I think it's maybe theoretical waffle as opposed to the actual details of what I would say naming. But in principle, the idea that in fact the working class is bigger than ever and probably more diverse than ever as well. And then in regards to overthrowing capitalism, yeah, absolutely. I do believe that there is an impending fully automated luxury communist utopia waiting for all of us, and the seeds of that are within us all at our own grasp. Although that's slightly simplistic, and obviously it's infinitely more complicated than that. But I'd just like to come back a little bit to safe space, if that's okay. And safe space for me is first and foremost as a contrasting experience for me for being within Trotskyite parties, the Socialist Party, which has its committee in its darkened rooms, where even as a member you don't particularly hear a lot, and then the SWP, of course, that barbarically bans factions, which is, as far as I'm concerned, unforgivable, and says everything you need to know about the SWP and their collapse that has followed. And that the founding principles of safe space expose, for me, failures in the Trotskyite left, as they are contrasting ideas, and that the safe space policy that has been so formative and fundamental to the student movement over the last few years, that has its finger on the pulse in a sense. That was in tune with what was going on with the student movement at that time. So what that tells you about it is that it's flexible, that the politics of safe space emerged from the politics of the student movement in that point. And my experience of the left, otherwise left parties, Trotskyite parties, is that they are incapable of being flexible. They are incapable of adjusting to what is going on at that particular point. And for us, for the student movement, safe space politics continues to be formative and foundational. As to whether or not I would prescribe that or find some way where I can conceive that as being a world governing system, I don't know. But there are certain elements and principles within that I think can offer us remedies to the failures of my experience in the trot left, I guess.
Nancy.
Your point about how do you define yourself, whether you define yourself as a woman or from an ethnic minority, do you see yourself as working class first, or how do you define yourself? And I think that I'll come back to my original point, which is that we acknowledge in the Marxist, Trotskyist organisations that the working class is divided. And that's how I opened my contribution, was that we acknowledge that capitalism divides the working class up, divides them between women and men, black and white, old and young, etc. And that it's not true that you can achieve liberation just through joining a struggle, for instance, around gender lines or around racial lines. And I mean, you can just see, during the election I debated with my local MP who calls herself a feminist, Stella Creasy, did a lot of women-only meetings. And this is a woman who proudly defines herself as a feminist, and yet voted for the benefit cap, which put women and children onto the streets. voted for Trident, you know, is associated with the neoliberal wing of the Labour Party and yet proclaims itself a feminist. You can see a rebellion against this idea of the black middle class in America, where you've got Black Lives Matter, where there's like an uprising amongst the youth against an older generation who thought just if they got on, if they got enough money, then that would improve the lives of millions of people across the States. Not so. The position of the black working class in America is much worse, even with a black president. The same is true in all these marginalised communities, and therefore it's a bit like all roads lead to Rome. We have to come back to the question of class again and the need to unite the working class to overthrow capitalism. And once again, I'd say you have to be in a revolutionary party to be conscious of your class and to be conscious of what you're up against. In terms of like the dark rooms and the Trotskyist left, well, come and see. I invite people here to come to the Socialist Party and to join us and get involved with us and experience it for yourself, because I would say we are the most democratic revolutionary party on the left. All our documents are there for discussion and debate. It's not true we don't disagree. I'm very vocal inside my party of disagreeing, of putting forward alternative ideas, of perhaps not agreeing on the tactics or nuances and strategy, etc. It's not true that it's free-flowing and open of ideas. It's a slur, actually, to say that about the Socialist Party, because that is not what goes on inside our organisation. Conversely, the adherence to safe spaces, like Toby has alluded to, have lined up with those on the right wing of the movement who literally have blood on their hands. You know, in Unison Labour conference, motions were moved to condemn the Socialist Party and our position on safe spaces, from a woman who, you know, backed the Iraq War and the rape camps and the victimisation of women in those parts of the world. These people have allied themselves with the neoliberal right in many ways. They're using the cover of so-called liberation to implement a right-wing agenda with no accountability. And I'm with Toby. I think it's a cover. I think it's a cover for right-wing ideas, and it should be exposed as that. In no way should chancellors in universities be colluding with right-wingers in protest movements to expel the Trotskyist left off campuses. I think that's an outrage.
Well, I agree with much of what Nancy said there. I won't dwell on it. I'll go on to other things maybe I disagree with elsewhere or clarify my position. I mean, speaking as a Marxist, I actually disagree with direct democracy, right? I believe in indirect democracy because I believe in accountability. That might sound like a contradiction, but hopefully we'll be able to thrash that one out. I mean, to me, if you take direct democracy, I'll give you an example, it's a referendum, right? To me, that's the device of a dictator, right? What I want is a situation, yes, of delegates elected, delegates replaceable, and precisely, you know, in terms of, hopefully I haven't slurred the Socialist Party. What I was arguing for, Nancy, I wasn't suggesting for one moment there aren't disagreements inside the Socialist Party. What I was trying to allude to is they are not openly thrashed out, and I think that's an absolutely fundamental thing. So I want to hear what different delegates and different people say, and want to vote saying, I want that person withdrawn, I want that person elected. Not that I decide, by the way. Civic republicanism. I also believe, as a Marxist, I want to abolish law, right? Not in the sense of agreements, but all this bloody 20 volumes, well, 20 volumes, come on, you know, this massive legislation, right? I don't think human beings need to have their relation, maybe you would agree with me, maybe we're using the word law in a different way, but I want to get rid of lawyers, I want to get rid of all of that bloody nonsense, along with the city and prisons, and I think human beings can just manage their affairs, with some violence maybe, with some fierce arguments, but we, throughout most of our history, have managed pretty well without these sorts of institutions. And also, just finally, as a Marxist, I also want to get rid of democracy. Why? Because democracy, for me as a Marxist, is a form of the state. It involves violence, it involves special armed bodies. All of that needs to go, right? So maybe we've got quite a lot of disagreements there.
Okay, so I'll take some more
Can I just come in one class? Absolutely central, by the way. Just want to make my...
Cheers.
In case there's anybody under
okay, so two down here. So Ephraim.
Well, I just pretty much pick on that last point, but also on what Nancy said, I'd just like to provoke perhaps Luke and Simon to who've both mentioned the kind of new role that identity plays in liberation politics, and especially in the student movement, the whole role of liberation officers in the NUS. Whether you agree that the divisions of race are kind of appearances within capitalism and that class comes first. And if not, with such a fragmented left in this sense, how do you propose that we start to organise people when their personal experience and identity is so foregrounded? How can we have something that kind of transcends that, and perhaps how would a party relate to that?
My question is directed to Michael and to Nancy. So for Michael, there's this. You raised this concept of civic virtue, civic republicanism, and I want to know how, for you, how does the concept of civic virtue or republicanism actually change through the emergence of bourgeois society and then through capitalism? So how does the concept of civic virtue actually change between the 18th and 19th centuries? And is that, is there a change? And is this indeed to be distinguished from your ancient Athenian example? And one of the texts that, that what you said brings to my mind is Marx's 18th Brumaire, where he argues that the election of Napoleon's nephew actually signifies a moment in which the people who voted him in power are actually, asking to be made unfree, in this particular way. And so my question to you is there a, what is the shift, what's the change in civic virtue, and also what is the difference between civil society and the masses? The masses being like the people who elected this Bonaparte figure. In relation to that, for Nancy, how does the left stand in relation to securing votes or participating in politics when the character of its constituency of the masses has undergone these changes throughout the 18th and 19th century? Like, what is the role of the left in this? Oh, sorry, what's the role of the party? Yeah, that was my question to Nancy.
Okay. So I'll do another round after this. There was one up there.
I guess a dose of miserable pessimism as we go to the back. Mostly directed at Luke. I mean, I talked about safe space in relation to the student movement, and I get, I was there in 2010 and 2011. I wasn't on the roof, on the marches, and we had student assemblies in London. It was all terribly exciting, and we lost. They put the fees up from 9 grand, got rid of the MA, and universities, admittedly at this point, looking at it from the outside, or appreciably worse, more capitalist, more horrible securo places now than they are. And it's in that period when what remains of student politics has been slowly gutted. ULU closed last year, that kind of thing. That the safe spaces form of politics has come to the fore. It doesn't strike me as something that's redolent of the enormous internal strength of the student movement, but actually the opposite. It's a residue of defeat. And I guess on a related point, Nancy was talking about kind of enormous amounts of precarity, and she said stuff like, well, the working class has changed, this is the shape of them. On that level, it's true, but it seems to me that, again, this is not something that's come out of nowhere. If I go around, the sort of touristy bit of Bermondsey, where they've maintained half a day's work offloading ships the early 1900s. You know, in situations where workers aren't organised, where they don't have that collective power, conditions are shit. Work is precarious. It's the natural state of work under capitalism, except that capitalism imposes resistance, blah, 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 blah. So precisely, it seems to me that, again, I appreciate that, you know, they're all grounds for optimism, the working class is large, but precisely the fact that we have this enormous precarious semi-surplus population surely testifies to the fact that we are in a much worse position as an organised political force than we have been for a long time.
Okay, so we had that question. We had the question from Wentai about bourgeois democracy, as I took it to be, and what was the other question? Oh, yes, it was from Ephraim as well, on the same similar subject to the question at the back. I'd like to just underscore Wentai's question a little bit, and before I bring things back in. I think there might be disagreements on the panel that I'd like to hear more about in terms of the progressive aspects of liberalism. I think Michael seems to be saying that liberalism, tout court, is kind of to be rejected in some way. And so I would like to hear more from other speakers on that, which relates to this question of bourgeois democracy, perhaps. Okay, so we'll go in the other order. We'll go Jack first.
Okay, well, I don't agree with Chris Castroni and Platypus on liberalism, but maybe that's a sort of more private debate. But what I wanted to actually maybe throw in, because I presume we're winding up at some point soonish.
Yes, I think I'll take one last round of questions.
Okay, what I wanted to just throw in for all of us maybe, I mean, I've not got, you know, hey, this is the answer, but in terms of some of the stuff that Nancy's been talking about, in terms of what other panellists have been talking about, in terms of the weaker trade union movement, although if we actually think back in terms of history, one of the things that's notable about Britain is I think it forms the first working class party which wasn't based on the trade unions, but was enormous and was enormously powerful, and it's called Chartism. I'm not saying, oh, let's all go and be Chartist, but, you know, history has got some lessons for us. It doesn't rely on, you know, having the dockers brilliantly organised or the mines there. You can organise ordinary people simply on the basis of political demands, and their demand was one person, one vote, and there was the radical wing of it that, didn't it come out with your historian, wasn't it the Charter Plus, or what was it called?
The Charter on Something More.
Something More, and what the something more was, I think, was working class power, democracy. So in terms of where we are now, in terms of what James just brought up, in terms of what we've been discussing, yes, we are in a new situation. That does not mean that we're trapped with old answers. We can come up with new answers. Yes, and the advantage of Chartism, to me, and the advantage of a party, is that it is universal. And my approach, at least, to what I mean by the working class is that section of the population that has got no historic interest in hierarchy, in domination, in the difference, you know, in terms of status between men and women. To me, you know, being a partisan of the working class is to be a partisan of humanity. That's what I think being pro-working class is. It's not about glorifying, what was the phrase? White middle-aged, you know, muscular, whatever. It's nothing about that. It's about us as human beings living as human beings to the full extent that we're capable of living as human beings.
Okay, I think the question was, how are we going to sort of replicate what's going on in Europe and get votes?
Oh yeah, it was just briefly. It was just how do you see the left's role in participating in a politics where sort of the object of politics maybe it's changed from being civil society to something that we would call the masses throughout the 19th century. So how does the left actually navigate that terrain, secure votes? I'm sorry if I'm not making.
I'm not actually clear about what you're asking, but I think that what you're saying is that in the absence of something like the classical working classes described before, how do we orientate ourselves? Is that what you're
Is it more about how the left participates in bourgeois democracy?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, for instance, I mean, this is a big, probably, disagreement that we would have, because our history in the Socialist Party, we were inside the Labour Party and we did get MPs elected inside the Labour Party. And we didn't see their role as to go into Parliament and, and you know, leave it at that. We saw them as, you know, as activists and being very connected to the struggle outside. So, for instance, I mentioned we were very instrumental in bringing the poll tax down. 18 million people didn't pay. Our MPs never paid their poll tax and went to prison for not paying their poll tax. And that's what distinguished them from, if you like, left reformists, people who went into power, a bit like SYRIZA, very flattered to be at the top table and forgetting that the struggle, maybe we would agree, the struggle is outside Parliament, and these workers' representatives were like if you like, a conduit for the class to put extra pressure on for. And we're doing that in Seattle. We've got a socialist elected in Seattle. If you Google her, you'll find that she's been arrested, that there is now a fund to try and get rid of her from the city-state council, because she's so effective in being an activist. She was at the Boeing workers' picket line. You know, she doesn't see herself as in the city council and negotiating, you know, the retreat, if you like, and then justifying it to a constituency. There's a big sort of link there. There's a link there. We're using bourgeois democracy. We have no faith in it, and it's not going to be the avenue to revolution. It's just a platform. But it exists in the minds of millions of workers. I know myself, by selling the socialists on the street, lots of working class people don't want to talk to you. As soon as the election's announced, they're like, oh, this is my time. I'm allowed to think about politics now. I can talk about it. So therefore we use bourgeois elections to engage with people and to discuss with them, etc. So I think that that's how we see our representatives. At the moment inside TUSC, one of the things we're saying is nobody should vote for cuts. You know, anybody who's elected as a councillor, and we've got councillors who are allied to us in Hull, etc., in Southampton, they're not to raise their hands and vote for cuts. That's a big thing, considering there are elected anti-austerity people across Europe who are voting for cuts. They were elected in as anti-austerity candidates and they're voting for cuts. So I think that that's how we see bourgeois democracy, parliamentary elections, etc. And that's how we would use workers' representatives. I hope that answers your question. Just the thing about pessimism, because we are in the shit, aren't we? Like, it's terrible. It is awful. But I think that we do have to go back to history, that we have been here before, that we have been in a state where there was no social security, where we didn't have a national health service, where people didn't have permanent contracts, where we were fighting each other like animals for a bit of work. And we formed the trade unions. We formed mighty trade unions. And I think what we have to have the historical imagination is that when it catches, it could catch like a spark. It could be like New Unionism. And for anybody who hasn't read about what happened in the East End and New Unionism, it happened very quickly in a small space of time where, you know, a de-skilled, if you like, a layer of the class got active. And it's entirely possible for something like that to happen again. In fact, I would say it's almost inevitable, because the next generation cannot live. They cannot live. There's no homes, the work's rubbish, and it's insecure. So that is what we're sort of heading towards. And I think from the Socialist Party's point of view, we would say, you know, reclaim the old right-wing unions. We've got our comrades inside Unison and Unite, a battering at the bureaucrats inside Unite, and at the same time trying to organise, you know, young people and youth fight for jobs, etc. So, sorry, I'm going to go on.
Okay, so the banning of paper sellers on campus under the auspices of safe-space policy is not something I agree with, and it was something that I actually quite vehemently argued against, because I don't think that's a particularly I don't think that is a healthy democracy that the safe space policy was crafted or emerged to protect. And in regards to the idea, the emergence of, I guess, liberation and identity politics on campus, with lots of universities across the country having welfare and diversity officers and that kind of thing. And I also think it's a really difficult and highly weighted analytical point to try and decide what is more important or historically influential, whether that's class or racism or gender, because the reality of it is, I think, is part of a web of oppressive social relations. But from my own personal point of view, I think class is probably the most important in terms of the historical creation and emergence of capitalism. And I think I personally, from my personal point of view, would go with class, but I don't want to diminish the other as related to class, as intertwined with class, as part of a wider web of oppressive social relations. And in terms of the NUS and the failure of the student movement, I guess post 2010, and also the fact that tuition fees went up, I think the NUS is broken. I think the protest that we had last year, so this academic year, that I think was about 40 to 50,000 students, NUS pulled out and didn't endorse the protest. I think the NUS is full of careerists and full of bureaucrats, and has been a stepping stone for people to go into mainstream sort of Westminster politics. And I think the NUS is fundamentally a broken mechanism. But I also think there are questions to be raised about how students have organised since then. In terms of my own experience with Goldsmiths, our occupation won 6 of our demands. The Disabled Student Access Scheme, which funded note takers and laptops for people who are disabled, was going to be cut. It's now not. We also got promised, and it has now come into effect, that our waiting list for our counselling service will get reduced by 50%. It has. We also campaigned for an all-union committee to oversee this new economic plan that Goldsmiths is about to introduce. That's happening. So I think it's sometimes hard to define whether or not we won or lost. I know certainly NUS is broken. I know that for sure. And about whether or not there could be a uniform left, I don't really know what a uniform left is. I kind of believe that in a non-uniform left that is kind of organised. I don't know what you mean by uniform, I guess, because everyone has their own subjective interpretation of the left, and mine is based on, you know, William Morris and being in the Labour Party and all these little things that are a part of, I guess, my political education, and everyone has that, and I think that's really important. And I think it's really important for leftist education to encourage that kind of that variety. So I don't know what a uniform left is, I guess.
I guess I just meant, can anything transcend personal experience in the party?
I think that's our aim.
Sense?
I think that's got to be the aim. I think we've got to grapple with personal experience, with identity politics, with all of this. We've got to grapple with it. That's absolutely where we're at, I think, as a student move. But I think ultimately the aim is to kick on and move on from that.
Yeah. Civic republicanism and bourgeoisie democracy, to reply to your questions. So as I was saying in my text, civic republicanism should not be seen as something identical with urbanization, with a city, in a few words, with a passive electorate or with a constituency, as the liberal world understands it. On the contrary, it implies the existence of a real, physical, participatory, interactive, self-reflective, and clearly observable entity. This entity is the political body. You don't have this today, because you can't have it. Bourgeoisie democracy is based on representation, not on direct participation, because it considers you, the ordinary people, as incapable to decide. Because for the minds that constituted bourgeoisie democracy, the masses are ignorant. They can't take it upon themselves. They are the ruthless mob who will kill everyone on their way if you allow them to take power. So that's a big difference. To be more specific, I'm speaking English and not Greek. In Greek, I would not use the word civic. I would use the word polis. The polis, the ecclesia in ancient Athens, was the body politic aiming to restrict upper powers. The Roman civitas, which was the Roman translation of the polis, was meant the opposite. It was the body of the aristocracies aiming to control and to restrict the plebs, the other way around. And now let's go to the bourgeoisie concept. The French Revolution, says Robespierre, was written in the books of Machiavelli, who was passionate to revive the context of Roman antiquity, not on Greek antiquity, on Roman antiquity. And this is why the word civic has been hijacked by the liberal world and has been mistranslated as bourgeoisie context. In fact, the word civic is based on the polis, is based on something completely different of what we understand today. And here comes the concept of civic virtue. Civic virtue, in Greek I would say political virtue, but in English I've never seen it anywhere. It doesn't require laws, basically. It doesn't require lawyers, because it's based on the concept that we know what is good and what is bad. We don't need somebody else to tell us what to do and what not to do. If we do something wrong, we are here to correct ourselves. That's the concept of civic virtue. In a more sophisticated language, it's called civic humanism, or political humanism, to be more precise, because we have issues with the word civic, and actually it's true, yes, because Marx was definitely right when he was saying that civilization is actually a bourgeoisie concept. But if you see a little bit deeper, the word civic has a long, long history, even before it's not a modern concept, it's not a Roman concept. It's something that goes beyond the Roman world, beyond the world where representation started to become the main idea of society, of ruling the world. So it's a very huge concept. Did it cover you at some point? Okay.
So you're suggesting we should attempt to restore Athenian polis?
No.
Okay.
Only an idiot would do that. I'm not saying to restore. I'm not saying that the Athenian polis, the Spain of '36, Roman respublica, the Hungary councils, or the Soviet councils. I'm not saying that these examples are models.
Okay.
They are examples that we can study. They are sources of inspiration and not sources that we should copy today in order to solve our problems. So if you want more, contact me later.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'll probably not be able to take more questions, so just have a few summing up remarks after this.
Okay. So are these my summing up remarks?
No, I'll let you come.
They can be my summing up remarks, it's okay. Unless they're anything specific.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I guess, yes, so I had a question about liberalism. I feel like we also haven't done on the question of social democracy either. I feel like that is a question that's been left to the side. So the question of but I guess we'll have to. I think that there's still a lot of questions for me around the Labour Party as well, and how the left relates to the Labour Party in Britain. So if you can say something about that as well as liberalism, that would be great.
Social democracy. Oscar Wilde said the problem with socialism is it cuts into your evening so much. So I'll try and be quite brief. But there was a question about higher education that was really interesting. Higher education is a fantastic example, not fantastic in a good sense, example of how the kind of tentacles of neoliberalism are reaching into areas that were previously protected, institutions that were previously protected. And, I've seen that. I started teaching Goldsmiths in 2008, and the way in which higher education has become commercialised, it's become a product, and students have become consumers who are attending university for the instrumental value of education, because they need something to a piece of paper to make them employable, has changed the nature of teaching, considerably for the worse. The idea of teaching for its own sake is falling by the wayside. And, you know, you mentioned the occupation, how it got one of the successes of the occupation was an increase in the counselling service. You know, part of the reason people are so stressed and people come to see me every week because they're so stressed, because there's so much pressure on them to come out of Goldsmiths with a 2-1 or whatever it is at the end of the day, because education is an instrumental thing now, and you know that's bad for students and it's bad for people who are carrying out research. You know, departments will close down, courses are being closed down if they aren't recruiting customers, students, and soon institutions will close down as well if they aren't successful, regardless of how good they are. So, you know, there's a great gamble going on in higher education at the moment, and it's fundamentally changing the nature of teaching in quite a sad way. There were questions about liberalism, and I guess this is where I'm more kind of pluralistic than the rest of the panel. You know, my leftism draws a whole variety of different sources, and you know, liberalism was, of course, one of the great kind of Enlightenment projects. But the various liberals you can draw on, I feel you can draw on as sources of kind of strength and support for a leftist argument, and these might be the kind of the new liberals of the earlier 20th century, not neoliberals, new liberals, people like Jay Hobson, who later joined the Labour Party and left on the left of the Labour Party, but people who base their arguments on a view of autonomy, but argue that capitalism crushes that autonomy. You know, people like that are interesting, and you know, they say interesting things about freedom in the same way that William Morris can tell us things about freedom, and tell us things about experiments in living, and provide us with an idea of a different kind of society that we should move towards. And there was a really interesting question about the relationship between class and forms of identity. And I think, you know, that's one of the big questions of our time, to which I don't really have an answer, but I often find that class, particularly in public kind of discourse, is suppressed as a category in favour of other forms of identity, and that's definitely an unhealthy thing.
All right, I'll let others give some closing remarks. We should bring it back to the question of the party. What is a political party then? Given this discussion that we've just been having. So I'll continue maybe down, moving from Michael down.
Why not from Simon?
Oh yes, okay, Simon, do you want to say something finally about the party?
I didn't have an answer to that, give it away. No. No, I mean, you know, what I'm really struck by is the as I said in my opening remarks, what is a kind of crisis of the traditional left, particularly the mainstream left, and that's a party political crisis in many ways. And you know, and what struck me tonight and what worries me is the fragmentation of the left, and the fragmentation of the left means that the Conservatives are in power, and could be in power for a long, long time if the left continues to fragment. So you know, the Labour Party, for all its many, many, many faults, is at the moment a vehicle, I think, that can be, working with trade unions can offer some kind of future until something better comes along. But I really worry about the consequences of not trying to change the Labour Party and trying to get the unions involved in the Labour Party.
Thank you.
Yes. If a leftist populist party is going to take power, should always be under the control of the people, in councils, in any system. Otherwise, it will soon reach the point of PASOKification. Do you know this word?
Yeah.
Yeah. So even your parties, even one of your parties will become the ruling party. I doubt if they will stay in power over a month without becoming the next PASOK or the next Labour Party. So your question is, what is a party, basically? It's an apparatus, basically, that takes power using the concept of representation. But as I said before, so
What about the subtitle of this? So, what does it mean for the left to act politically? What kind of organisations do we need for that?
council democracy. Well, what can I say? Rosa Luxemburg is a great source of inspiration. Some anarchist writers are also can be seen also as sources of inspiration. I don't fancy anarchism that much. Well, some forms of ancient democracy, we can rely on Rousseau, so this is the type of concept I have in mind, and if there are parties, they must be in the control of the people. They must be in the control from the masses of below. Otherwise, welcome the next Labour Party.
I certainly don't believe the Labour Party is the option or has been an option for a while. I certainly don't believe they are a party of the working class, or within their nature is the desire to overturn capitalism and deliver a world better than that for the masses. I don't believe they have represented that probably at any point. I'm not opposed to leftist political parties. My own experience from being in three was that there wasn't the flexibility of opinion, the room for the debate and discussion for us to eventually move beyond their own sort of dogma and this own sort of inflexibility. But do I know of a leftist political party in this country that I think can provide me with that and exists now? And I go, no. So in the absence of that, I'm thinking, how do we as a student movement organise? And I think safe space policy has lots of problems, but I also think it contains lots of potential. I certainly know from someone who started at the Goldsmiths occupation opposed to safe space policy. By the end of it, I saw that there was, from my own opinion, there was a transformation in the atmosphere. I felt like it had equalised lots of things and it empowered lots of people to get involved who perhaps wouldn't have got involved. I can't speak beyond any more than my own experience. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but yeah, I guess that's it.
I think the challenge for the left is a dual task. If we want to overthrow capitalism, we need a revolutionary party to overthrow capitalism. I personally believe that's the Socialist Party, and I'd encourage anybody who's interested to get in touch and join. But I did mention the dual task because I do think that the most conscious revolutionary fighters as well should be involved in constructing a new mass workers' party, not a Labour Party Mark II, but because it's a organic development. We're living through it in all across Europe. We're living through this organic development. It's a phase that the working class passes through. The million-dollar question is, will that new mass workers' party betray the working class, possibly like SYRIZA or Podemos, or will we build it enough of a revolutionary force within that new mass workers' party to take power? That is what the Socialist Party sees its task for. I'm an anarchist, really. In my soul, I'm an anarchist. I agree with this civic paradise. But after the revolution, because before then, the state will crush you. That's the experience. The state will crush you. And one of the best models, is, even though it's been corrupted, is the Soviets. The Soviets existed in the towns and cities. The left is not the Labour Party. The left is the working class and the ability of revolutionaries to unite it. Even if the Labour Party never gets into power again, doesn't necessarily mean that the left will not take power. That's what we're living through. So I think the first contributions are on there. My closing remark.
Yeah, I think that, at least where I'm coming from, what I'm concerned about first and foremost isn't about the next government or the next government or the next government. So in that sense, quite frankly, the idea that Miliband lost, or that Brown lost, or that Andy Burnham might possibly lose, doesn't actually terrify me. Why? because what I think we really need to be concerned with, first and foremost, is actually constructing a decent opposition, something that can actually stand up for working class people. I mean, what comes to my mind, in terms of one of my formative experiences, we're talking about, you know, what makes us ourselves, is actually going down to Pentonville jail. I think it was 1972. The Tories had just locked up 5 dockers for deliberately getting arrested because they were breaking the Industrial Relations Act. And because the TUC said, if you don't let them go, we'll call a general strike, they let them out. Now, to me, what would I rather have? A Wilson government, a Callaghan government, or the working class being able to turn around and say, if you do that, we're going to do something, we're going to get a compromise. Now, in terms of my opposition, I want an opposition that is committed to socialism, committed to communism, committed to human freedom, right? That's my perspective, not something that's going to... I don't agree with you about Labour politicians in that sense. You know, yes, they're concerned, and they've been historically concerned with scattering a few crumbs to us. I mean, I don't believe that most Labour politicians like the cuts, but I do believe most Tories do, right? But my point is, I don't want the crumbs. I want the bloody bakery. Well, that's surely what we're about. We want control of our lives. We want control back. Just one final point, if I can, with your indulgence. I don't like the term bourgeois democracy. Anyone who's been to work, including here, let alone in a factory, tell me when the bosses turn around to the workers and say, well, as a bourgeois, I believe in bourgeois democracy, so we're going to have a vote on this. Right? I've never noticed it. I think that this thing, bourgeois democracy, has been won by us. If they had their way, we would not have the vote. I've already mentioned Chartism. Right? That wasn't something they gave us with the development of the means of production. It's something the working class won. And if we want to name at least 2 individuals that were responsible, what's August J. Nimtz? I don't know, you must have come across him. Right? You have him speaking in America. You know, this American guy came up with the idea, the democratic breakthrough in Europe. Right? Who was, at least in terms of individuals, responsible for it? I would name you 2, Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels. So yes, they've corrupted bourgeois democracy. So on May the 7th, wasn't it? Yeah. General election. What did they give me a choice of? Between shit, shit, shit and shit. Right? Well, that's what they've given us a choice of. I would have. No, Nancy, I would have voted. But I'm talking not only about me. I would have voted for you. I'd have voted for TUSC without question. I criticise you. I would have voted for it. But in terms of ordinary people, that is what they're being asked to do. That's what fills up the TV. That's what fills up debate. That's what fills up the House of Commons, anyway. So we want a real alternative. That's what we need.
Thank you very much to all our panellists. So do join us in the New Cross House. I realise it's getting a bit late now. Thank you so much to all our panellists. I really appreciate you all coming down.
And the sign-up sheet. Please, everyone, make sure you sign up.
Sign up for that.